Sarah Mitchell's arthritic fingers stopped mid-reach for the wire cutters, her breath catching in her throat as she stared into the most human eyes she'd ever seen on a wild animal. The massive grizzly bear, trapped in cruel steel wire that cut deep into his flesh, wasn't snarling or thrashing, he was pleading. This wasn't the savage beast she'd expected to find bleeding in the Montana wilderness. This was a soul in agony, asking for help. The forest fell silent except for the bear's labored breathing, each exhale a whisper of pain that made Sarah's chest tighten. Her neighbor's coffee mug crashed to the ground behind her, forgotten as he stumbled backward in shock. Sweet Jesus, Sarah, that thing could tear you apart. But those amber eyes held no violence, only the same desperate hope she'd seen in her grandson Tommy's face before he'd slipped away from her forever. The same trust, the same silent plea, "Please don't let me die alone." "Get the hell away from there!" Jim shouted, his voice cracking with terror. What kind of creature shows mercy to those who've shown him none? And why did looking at him feel like staring into the face of a miracle she'd lost faith in finding? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months before that life-changing moment in the wilderness, Sarah Mitchell had been counting down the days until she could afford to die with dignity. At 67, the former Army nurse lived alone in a weathered cabin 15 miles outside Whitefish, Montana, surviving on Social Security checks that barely covered her arthritis medication and heating bills. The $847 monthly payment Frank had promised would be plenty for our golden years felt like a cruel joke now that everything cost 3 times what it used to. Her husband of 42 years had been gone 3 winters now, taken by the same lung cancer that had claimed half the men in his Vietnam unit. The house still smelled like his Lucky Strikes and Old Spice aftershave, scents she couldn't bear to wash away. Every morning, Sarah made coffee for 2 out of habit, then poured the second cup down the drain while talking to Frank's faded photograph on the kitchen table. "Another lonely day ahead of us, sweetheart," she'd whisper, her voice echoing in rooms that once rang with laughter when their grandchildren visited. But those visits had stopped after the accident. After Tommy, 8-year-old Tommy Patterson had been the light of Sarah's world, the freckle-faced boy who called her Grandma Cookie because of her legendary chocolate chip recipe. Every summer, he'd spend weeks at the cabin, fishing with Grandpa Frank and learning to whittle on the front porch. Tommy had been fearless in the woods, always wandering off to explore, coming back with pockets full of interesting rocks and wild stories about the forest friends he'd met. 2 years ago, Tommy had drowned during a family camping trip to Glacier National Park. The official report said he'd fallen into Swift Creek during a flash flood, his body swept away by the merciless current. The search lasted 18 days before they declared him dead, though no body was ever recovered. Sarah's daughter Lisa blamed everyone, the Park Service, the guide company, even Sarah for encouraging Tommy's love of the wilderness. "If you hadn't filled his head with all those fairy tales about friendly forest animals, he never would have wandered off," Lisa had screamed at the funeral service. "He thought everything in the woods was safe because of your stupid stories." The family fractured after that. Lisa moved to Seattle with her husband and remaining children, calling only on major holidays with forced politeness. Sarah's son Michael sent dutiful birthday cards from Phoenix but never visited. The silence in the cabin grew thicker each winter, broken only by the occasional phone call from well-meaning church ladies who eventually stopped trying. Sarah had considered selling the cabin and moving to a senior community in town, but the thought of leaving her last connection to Frank and Tommy felt like a betrayal. Besides, the property was worth almost nothing now that the timber rights had been sold to some big corporation from back east. She was trapped between poverty and pride, counting down days in a place where every corner held memories of happier times. The wire cutters in her arthritic hands had belonged to Frank, kept sharp and ready in his tool shed alongside dreams they'd never fulfill together. The morning of September 23rd started like every other day in Sarah's carefully constructed routine of survival. She woke at dawn, made 2 cups of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table telling Frank's photograph about her plans to walk the old logging trail behind their property. It was the same walk she'd taken every day since his funeral, a ritual that kept her moving when everything inside wanted to stop. "Going to check on that old beaver dam today, honey," she murmured to the faded image of her husband in his army dress uniform. "Remember how Tommy used to love watching them work? Said they were the hardest workers in the whole forest." The September air carried the crisp promise of winter as Sarah pulled on Frank's old hunting jacket and grabbed his walking stick from beside the door. Her arthritic knees protested the uneven terrain, but she pushed forward through the familiar maze of pine and aspen trees. This daily pilgrimage had become her anchor to sanity, the 1 hour when she could pretend Frank and Tommy might be waiting for her back at the cabin. 20 minutes into her walk, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold, a low, guttural moaning that sounded almost human in its anguish. She'd heard plenty of animal sounds in her 67 years, from birthing cattle to wounded deer, but this was different. This carried a weight of despair that resonated in her bones. Following the sound deeper into the woods, Sarah pushed through a thicket of mountain ash and stopped dead in her tracks. 30 feet ahead, caught in what looked like a spider web of gleaming steel wire, was the largest grizzly bear she'd ever seen. The massive animal was entangled in an elaborate snare system, the barbed wire cutting deep into his shoulder, chest, and front paw. Blood matted his dark brown fur, and his breathing came in shallow, exhausted pants. But what stopped Sarah's heart wasn't the bear's size or his obvious pain, it was his eyes. Instead of the wild fury she expected from a trapped predator, she saw something that reminded her of the wounded soldiers she'd tended in Korea: recognition, intelligence, and a heartbreaking plea for help. The bear turned his massive head toward her, and their eyes locked. In that moment, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since Tommy's death, a connection to another living being who understood suffering. The bear didn't growl or struggle against his bonds. He simply watched her with an expression so human it made her chest ache. "Oh, you poor baby," she whispered, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used with frightened patients in the field hospital. "What kind of monster did this to you?" The wire snare was clearly homemade but sophisticated, designed not for a quick kill but for prolonged torture. Multiple strands of barbed wire had been woven into a cruel net, positioned to tighten with every movement. The bear's attempts to free himself had only made the wires cut deeper, creating a web of agony that would eventually lead to a slow, painful death. Sarah's nursing instincts overrode her fear as she approached the trapped animal. She'd seen too much suffering in her lifetime to walk away from it now, regardless of the species. The bear remained perfectly still as she moved closer, his amber eyes tracking her every step but showing no aggression. "Easy now, big fella," she murmured, pulling Frank's old wire cutters from her jacket pocket. "I'm going to help you, but you've got to trust me. Can you do that?" The bear's response nearly brought her to her knees. He lowered his massive head in what could only be described as a nod, then let out a soft, chuffing sound that reminded her of a sigh. It was as if he understood not just her words, but her intention. Working carefully around the deadly wire, Sarah began the delicate process of freeing the bear. Each cut released pressure from his wounds, causing him to flinch with pain, but he never once moved aggressively toward her. Instead, he seemed to be holding perfectly still to make her job easier, occasionally making that soft, chuffing sound as if to encourage her efforts. As she worked, Sarah found herself talking to the bear the way she used to talk to her patients during painful procedures. "That's it. You're doing great. Just a few more cuts, and you'll be free. You're the bravest patient I've ever had. You know that?" The bear's response to her voice was remarkable. His breathing seemed to calm, and his eyes never left her face, as if he was drawing strength from her presence. It was a connection that defied everything Sarah thought she knew about wild animals, but felt as natural as breathing. When the last wire finally snapped free, Sarah expected the bear to bolt into the forest. Instead, he remained lying on his side, looking up at her with what could only be described as gratitude. Blood seeped from his wounds, and Sarah realized that freedom was only the first step in saving his life. Instead of fleeing into the safety of the deep woods as any wild bear should have done, the massive grizzly did something that defied every nature documentary Sarah had ever watched. He struggled to his feet, swaying slightly from blood loss and exhaustion, then turned and began walking slowly toward a cluster of rocks she hadn't noticed before. After a few steps, he stopped and looked back at her, his amber eyes clearly communicating a message. "Follow me." Sarah's rational mind screamed warnings about following a wounded predator deeper into the wilderness, but something stronger than logic compelled her forward. The bear moved with deliberate care, favoring his injured front paw but maintaining a pace that allowed her arthritic joints to keep up. Every few yards he would pause and glance back, ensuring she was still with him. The rocky outcropping revealed itself to be the entrance to a shallow cave, partially hidden by fallen logs and overgrown vegetation. The bear disappeared into the shadowy opening, and Sarah hesitated at the threshold. Following an injured animal into its den violated every survival instinct she possessed, yet the gentle way he'd looked at her suggested this wasn't a trap. It was an invitation. Inside the cave, Sarah's eyes adjusted to reveal something extraordinary. The space had been arranged with an intelligence that took her breath away. Soft pine boughs were carefully layered to create bedding areas. Smooth stones formed a shallow depression that collected water from a slow drip in the cave's ceiling. Most remarkably, one corner held a collection of items that could only have been gathered deliberately. A child's lost hiking boot, a torn piece of bright fabric, a dented water bottle, and what looked like a rescue whistle on a lanyard. "My God," Sarah whispered, understanding dawning on her like sunrise. "You've been saving people, haven't you?" The bear settled onto the pine bough bedding with a heavy sigh, his breathing labored but steady. Sarah knelt beside him, her nurse's training taking over as she examined his wounds more thoroughly. The wire cuts were deep but clean, and while there was significant blood loss, none of the injuries appeared to have damaged vital organs or major arteries. Using water from the cave's natural basin and strips of fabric torn from her cotton shirt, Sarah began cleaning the bear's wounds. He remained perfectly still during the process, occasionally making that soft chuffing sound when she hit a particularly tender spot. It was during this intimate act of care that Sarah noticed something that made her heart nearly stop. The bear's left front paw bore old scars, parallel lines that could only have been made by barbed wire. But it wasn't just any pattern of scars. Sarah had seen those exact marks before in photographs taken during the search for her grandson, Tommy. The rescue teams had found traces of blood on barbed wire near Swift Creek, blood they'd assumed was Tommy's. Now, looking at this bear's old wounds, an impossible possibility began forming in her mind. "Were you there?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "When Tommy fell in the creek, were you there?" The bear's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His ears perked forward and he made a series of soft vocalizations that sounded almost conversational. Then he did something that defied belief. He carefully reached out with his good paw and gently touched the pocket of Frank's old hunting jacket, the one where Sarah always kept Tommy's last school photograph. With trembling hands, Sarah pulled out the creased picture of her grandson. The bear's response was immediate and heartbreaking. He pressed his massive nose gently against the photograph, then looked directly into Sarah's eyes with an expression of such profound sadness that she began to cry. "You tried to save him, didn't you?" she sobbed, understanding flooding through her. The blood on the wire wasn't Tommy's, it was yours. You cut yourself trying to pull him out of the water." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with devastating clarity. Tommy's body had never been found because this bear had tried to rescue him, carrying him away from the violent creek to safety. But 8-year-old Tommy, already weakened by cold water and trauma, hadn't survived despite the bear's efforts. The friendly forest animals Tommy had always talked about weren't imaginary friends. They were real, and this magnificent creature had been watching over him during all those summer visits to the cabin. As if sensing her understanding, the bear gently nuzzled Sarah's hand, then moved to the corner of the cave where those rescued items were stored. Using his good paw, he carefully moved aside the hiking boot and fabric to reveal something that made Sarah's world tilt on its axis. Tommy's distinctive red baseball cap, the one she'd given him for his 8th birthday, carefully preserved and clearly treasured. Sarah's sobs echoed through the cave as she held her grandson's cap, finally understanding the truth about his final moments. Tommy hadn't died alone and afraid in the rushing water. He'd been found by a gentle giant who had risked everything to try to save him, who had carried him to safety and stayed with him until the end. The bear hadn't just been a witness to Tommy's death, he'd been his guardian angel. "He wasn't afraid, was he?" Sarah asked through her tears. "You stayed with him? You made sure he wasn't alone." The bear's response was to carefully take the baseball cap in his mouth and place it gently in Sarah's lap, then rest his massive head against her shoulder. It was a gesture of such tender comfort that Sarah felt her heart, frozen solid since Tommy's funeral, begin to crack open. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah wasn't alone with her grief. This incredible creature had been carrying the same burden, the same guilt over a child they both had loved and failed to save. But unlike her human family, who had fractured under the weight of tragedy, this bear had transformed his loss into purpose, dedicating his life to protecting other lost souls in the wilderness. As the afternoon light filtered through the cave entrance, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She was going to stay here with this wounded guardian, at least until he was strong enough to heal. More than that, she was going to protect him the way he had tried to protect Tommy, the way he had apparently been protecting others ever since. "What's your name, big guy?" she asked softly, stroking his thick fur. "Every hero deserves a proper name." The bear looked up at her with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and Sarah smiled through her tears. "Guardian," she said firmly. "That's what you are, isn't it? Tommy's guardian, and now mine too." As if approving of his new name, Guardian let out a contented rumble and closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to rest. For the first time since Frank's death, Sarah felt a sense of purpose returning to her life. She had found something worth fighting for again, and he had found someone willing to stand beside him. The 3 days that followed Sarah's discovery of Guardian transformed both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. What began as a simple act of rescue evolved into something far more profound. A partnership that would challenge everything the small mountain community thought they knew about the relationship between humans and wildlife. On the first evening, as Sarah prepared to spend the night in Guardian's cave, she made a decision that would have horrified her practical-minded husband. Using the emergency supplies from her backpack and some creativity born of desperation, she fashioned a makeshift camp inside the rocky shelter. Guardian watched her efforts with obvious interest, occasionally offering helpful nudges when her arthritic fingers struggled with knots or when she couldn't reach high enough to secure her tarp properly. "Frank would have a heart attack if he could see me now," Sarah muttered as she arranged her sleeping bag on a bed of pine boughs Guardian had somehow freshened during her brief absence. "Camping with a grizzly bear at my age. He'd say I'd finally lost what was left of my marbles." But as the night deepened and the Montana wilderness came alive with sounds that would have terrified her alone, Sarah felt safer than she had in years. Guardian positioned himself between her and the cave entrance, his massive presence a wall of protection against whatever dangers lurked in the darkness. When a pack of coyotes began their haunting chorus nearby, Guardian's low rumble of warning sent them yipping into the distance without ever showing themselves. Sleep came surprisingly easily, and Sarah woke to find Guardian had somehow acquired fresh trout for breakfast, presenting them to her with the pride of a cat bringing mice to its favorite human. The sight of this enormous predator carefully laying fish at her feet with such gentle consideration made her laugh for the first time since Tommy's funeral, a sound that seemed to please Guardian immensely, judging by his soft, chuffing response. The second day brought their first real test. Sarah had returned to her cabin to gather proper medical supplies and food, leaving Guardian to rest in the cave. When she returned 3 hours later, she found him agitated and clearly concerned about something. He led her to a cluster of pine trees where his superior sense of smell had detected something her human nose had missed: the acrid scent of human presence and the metallic tang of more wire traps. Following Guardian's guidance, Sarah discovered a horrifying network of illegal snares scattered throughout what had always been her peaceful walking route. The traps were sophisticated and cruel, designed not just to capture, but to cause maximum suffering. Some still held the remains of smaller animals, raccoons, foxes, even a young deer that had died slow, agonizing deaths. "Who would do something like this?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking with rage as she documented each trap with Frank's old camera. Guardian's response was a deep growl that spoke of personal knowledge and remembered pain. He knew exactly who was responsible, and his reaction suggested this wasn't the first time he'd encountered such cruelty. As they worked together to dismantle the traps, Sarah cutting wires while Guardian used his strength to bend metal stakes, a disturbing pattern emerged. The traps were positioned along game trails and hiking paths, but their placement showed intimate knowledge of local wildlife behavior. Whoever was setting them had been studying the area for months, possibly years. It was during this grim work that Sarah first heard the distant rumble of ATV engines. Guardian's immediate reaction was telling. His hackles rose, his ears flattened against his skull, and his entire body language shifted from calm cooperation to defensive alertness. He clearly recognized those particular engines, and the recognition filled him with dread. "Hide," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure why she was protecting him. Something about Guardian's terror made her protective instincts flare to life. "Go back to the cave. I'll handle this." But Guardian refused to leave her side, positioning himself slightly behind a large pine where he could watch while remaining concealed. The trust implicit in that decision, allowing her to face potential danger while trusting her to keep his location secret, moved Sarah profoundly. 3 men on ATVs emerged from the tree line, their machines loud and aggressive in the peaceful forest. The leader was a well-dressed man in his 50s with cold blue eyes and an expensive rifle strapped to his vehicle. Behind him rode 2 younger men who had the look of hired muscle rather than serious hunters. "Morning, ma'am," the leader called out, his tone friendly but his eyes calculating. "I'm Vincent Crawford from Billings. We're doing some wildlife management work in this area. You haven't seen any bears around here, have you? Big male, brown coat, probably acting aggressive?" Sarah's nursing background had given her years of experience reading people's true intentions, and everything about Vincent Crawford set off alarm bells. His expensive gear was at odds with his claim of wildlife management, and the way his companions kept glancing nervously at the tree line suggested they were hunting something specific, not conducting any legitimate survey. "Can't say I have," Sarah replied carefully, noting how Guardian remained perfectly motionless behind his tree. "Are you with the Forest Service?" I don't think I've seen any official notices about management activities in this area. Vincent's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Private contract work. There's been reports of a problem bear in the area, one that's lost its natural fear of humans. Fish and Wildlife wants it relocated before someone gets hurt. The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, but Sarah caught the inconsistency immediately. If this was legitimate wildlife management, why weren't they using tranquilizer equipment instead of high-powered rifles? Why was their gear set up for killing rather than capturing? "Well, I haven't seen anything unusual," she said firmly. "Just been out here cleaning up some illegal snare traps someone left behind. Terrible things. Looked like they were designed to torture animals rather than kill them cleanly." The effect of her words on Vincent was immediate and telling. His casual mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and furious underneath. "Snare traps, you say? Did you remove them?" "Every last one," Sarah replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Took pictures, too, for the authorities. That kind of cruelty shouldn't be tolerated in a civilized society." Vincent's jaw tightened, and one of his companions shifted nervously in his seat. "Those traps might have been part of our management program. You may have interfered with official business." "Then you won't mind if I verify that with Fish and Wildlife directly?" Sarah shot back, pulling out her cell phone. "I'm sure they'll be very interested in your methods." The standoff might have escalated, but Guardian chose that moment to make his presence known in the most diplomatic way possible. A soft, chuffing sound carried from the trees. Not aggressive, not threatening, just the sound of a large animal breathing. All three men immediately swiveled toward the noise, their weapons raised. "There!" Vincent hissed, his friendly facade completely abandoned now. "That's him!" But Guardian was too smart to be trapped. By the time the men reached the pine tree where he'd been hiding, they found only paw prints leading deeper into the forest. Prints that seemed to deliberately lead away from both Sarah and the cave that had become their sanctuary. "Damn it!" Vincent snarled, his true nature finally showing. "We almost had him." Sarah watched their frustrated search with growing certainty that this was no wildlife management operation. These men were hunting Guardians specifically, and their intentions were far from professional or humane. When they finally gave up and roared away on their ATVs, she was already planning her next move. That evening, Sarah made two crucial phone calls. The first was to her old friend Martha Henderson, who worked as a dispatcher for the county sheriff's office. The second was to Joseph Crow Feather, an elderly Blackfeet elder whose wisdom was respected throughout the region. "Martha, it's Sarah Mitchell. I need to report some suspicious activity on my property," she began, carefully documenting everything she'd observed about Vincent Crawford and his men. Martha promised to look into their permits and credentials, her tone suggesting she was already skeptical about their claims. The call to Joseph was even more revealing. When Sarah described Guardian and his unusual behavior, the old man's voice grew grave. "That bear has a name among my people," Joseph said quietly. "We call him Protector of the Lost. Stories about him go back 6 years, maybe more. Hikers who got turned around in the woods, children who wandered off from campsites, many owe their lives to that bear. He guides them to safety, brings them food and water, stays with them until help arrives." "6 years?" Sarah asked, thinking of the scars on Guardian's paw. "What happened 6 years ago?" Joseph's pause was heavy with old grief. "That's when the killing started. Someone began setting traps throughout the territory. Not for fur or meat, but for sport, for cruelty. Many bears died badly. The protector's mother was one of them. He was just a cub then, but he survived. Some say the trauma changed him, made him understand suffering in a way that most animals don't." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. Vincent Crawford wasn't conducting wildlife management. He was continuing a campaign of systematic torture that had been going on for years. Guardian wasn't just any bear. He was a survivor whose tragic past had transformed him into something extraordinary, a creature driven by grief to dedicate his life to protecting others. By the third day, Sarah had made a decision that would have shocked her family and terrified her friends. She wasn't going to let Vincent Crawford and his hunters destroy the most remarkable being she'd ever encountered. Guardian had saved her grandson's last moments from being filled with terror and loneliness. Now it was her turn to save him. The plan she developed was risky and probably illegal, but it felt like the most important thing she'd done since her nursing days in Korea. Using her knowledge of the local terrain and Guardian's incredible intelligence, she began preparing a defense of their shared territory that would protect not just one bear, but all the wildlife that called these mountains home. As the sun set on their third day together, Sarah sat beside Guardian in their cave, watching him carefully arrange and rearrange the precious items he'd collected from his rescue operations. Tommy's baseball cap held a place of honor in the collection, but it wasn't alone. Each item represented a life saved, a person who had been lost and found, guided to safety by a creature that the world saw as nothing more than a dangerous predator. "Tomorrow's going to be difficult," Sarah told him, gently stroking his fur, "but we're not going to let them win. You've been fighting this battle alone for too long. Now you have backup." Guardian's response was to rest his massive head against her shoulder, a gesture of trust and gratitude that sealed their unlikely partnership. Neither of them knew what the coming confrontation would bring, but they would face it together. An elderly widow and a grieving bear, united by loss and bound by a determination to protect the innocent from those who would do them harm. As darkness fell over the Montana wilderness, two unlikely friends prepared for a battle that would test everything they believed about courage, loyalty, and the true meaning of family. The confrontation Sarah had been dreading arrived with the dawn of the fourth day, announced by the aggressive roar of multiple ATV engines cutting through the morning stillness like chainsaws through silk. Guardian's reaction was immediate and visceral. His massive frame tensed, his ears flattened against his skull, and a low rumble of recognition vibrated through his chest. This wasn't the first time he'd heard those particular engines, and his body language spoke of remembered trauma and anticipated violence. Sarah pressed herself against the cave wall, watching through a gap in the fallen logs as Vincent Crawford and his hunting party emerged from the tree line. This time, he'd brought reinforcements. 6 men in total, all armed with high-powered rifles and what looked like military-grade equipment. Their formation was tactical, professional, and utterly ruthless in its efficiency. "Fan out," Vincent commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "The old woman and that beast are somewhere in this area. I want them found, and I want them found now." The casual way he lumped Sarah together with Guardian as targets to be eliminated sent ice water through her veins. This wasn't about wildlife management or even revenge anymore. Vincent Crawford had crossed a line into something far darker and more personal. Guardian pressed close to Sarah's side, his amber eyes fixed on the armed men spreading through their sanctuary. She could feel the tension coiled in his massive frame, every muscle ready for battle, but he made no move to attack. Instead, he seemed to be waiting, calculating, planning with an intelligence that continued to astound her. "I know you're out there," Vincent called, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Sarah Mitchell, isn't it? I did some checking after our little chat yesterday. Turns out you're quite the local hero. Army nurse, war veteran, pillar of the community. But that was a long time ago, wasn't it? Now you're just a crazy old woman who talks to pictures and thinks wild animals are her friends." The cruelty in his voice made Sarah's hands clench into fists, but she remained silent. Vincent was trying to provoke her into revealing their position, and she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. "Here's what's going to happen," Vincent continued, signaling to his men to spread out further. "You're going to come out of whatever hole you're hiding in, and you're going to walk away. This doesn't concern you. This is between me and that monster you've been harboring." Guardian's response was a soft, almost inaudible growl that only Sarah could hear. Monster. The word hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt a surge of protective fury that surprised her with its intensity. This magnificent creature who had spent years risking his life to save lost humans was being hunted by the real monster, a man whose grief had curdled into something toxic and destructive. "You see, Mrs. Mitchell," Vincent's voice took on a conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than his shouting, "that bear killed my son. Derek was 19 years old, just a kid, really, when that beast mauled him to death on a hiking trail not 10 miles from here. Tore him apart like he was nothing more than a rag doll." Sarah's blood ran cold. If that was true, if Guardian had actually killed someone, then everything she thought she knew about him was wrong. But something in Vincent's tone, the practiced way he delivered the story, made her suspect there was more to it than he was revealing. "Derek was supposed to be safe," Vincent continued, his voice cracking with what sounded like genuine anguish. "I paid for the best guides, the best equipment. I wanted him to learn what it meant to be a man, to face real challenges instead of hiding behind video games and participation trophies. But that bear, that goddamn bear, destroyed everything." One of Vincent's men had moved closer to their hiding spot, close enough that Sarah could see the professional way he held his rifle, the tactical vest that spoke of military or law enforcement training. These weren't weekend hunters or amateur poachers, they were professional killers, and Guardian was their target. Guardian seemed to sense the approaching danger, but instead of retreating deeper into the cave, he did something that stopped Sarah's heart. He began to move toward the cave entrance, preparing to face his hunters in the open rather than risk Sarah being caught in the crossfire. "No," Sarah whispered, grabbing a handful of his thick fur. "Don't you dare sacrifice yourself for me. We're in this together, remember?" But Guardian gently nuzzled her hand, his eyes filled with a determination that reminded her painfully of Frank in his final days. The same stubborn courage, the same willingness to face impossible odds to protect someone he loved. He was going to draw the hunters away from her, even if it meant his death. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as Vincent's patience finally snapped. "Burn them out," he ordered his men. "Use the flares. If they won't come out willingly, we'll smoke them out like the animals they are." The first flare arced through the morning air and landed in the dry brush near the cave entrance, immediately igniting the pine needles and dead vegetation that surrounded their sanctuary. Within minutes, the acrid smoke began filtering into the cave, making Sarah's eyes water and her breathing labored. Guardian's reaction to the fire was immediate and telling, not fear for himself, but desperate concern for Sarah. He moved between her and the growing smoke, using his massive body to shield her from the worst of it, but they both knew their position was becoming untenable. "Last chance!" Vincent shouted over the crackling flames. "Come out now, or burn with your pet monster!" It was then that Sarah made a decision that would have horrified her family and probably violated several laws. Pulling Frank's old service pistol from her jacket, the one she'd carried for protection during her daily walks but never thought she'd actually use, she stepped toward the cave entrance. "I'm coming out," she called, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Don't shoot. I'm unarmed." The lie about being unarmed was necessary, but Sarah had no intention of going quietly. If Vincent Crawford wanted to hurt Guardian, he was going to have to go through a 70-year-old Army nurse who had seen enough senseless violence to last several lifetimes. As she emerged from the cave with her hands partially raised, Sarah got her first clear look at Vincent Crawford's face, and what she saw there chilled her to the bone. This wasn't the expression of a grieving father seeking justice. This was the face of a man who had crossed so far over the line into madness that there was no coming back. "Where is he?" Vincent demanded, his rifle trained on Sarah's chest. "Where's the bear?" "Gone," Sarah lied smoothly, drawing on decades of experience dealing with dangerous patients in psychiatric wards. "He ran when he smelled the smoke. That's what wild animals do. They survive." Vincent's eyes narrowed, studying her face for signs of deception. "You're lying. That bear wouldn't abandon you." "I've been studying him for 2 years, learning his patterns, his weaknesses. He's got an unnatural attachment to humans, especially ones in distress. It's what makes him predictable, and predictability is what's going to get him killed." The casual way Vincent discussed his extended stalking of Guardian revealed the true scope of his obsession. This hadn't been a spontaneous hunting trip or even a simple revenge quest. It was the culmination of years of planning, studying, and preparing for this moment. "You want to know what really happened to Derek?" Vincent continued, his voice taking on a manic edge. "He wasn't killed by that bear. He was killed by my stupidity, my arrogance, my desperate need to turn my soft, gentle son into something he was never meant to be." Sarah's suspicions were confirmed with those words, but the admission brought her no satisfaction, only a deeper understanding of the tragedy that had created this monster. "I pushed him into those mountains," Vincent confessed, his rifle wavering as emotion overtook him. "Ignored the weather warnings, dismissed the guide's concerns, forced him to keep going when every instinct told us to turn back. And when the storm hit, when Derek fell into that ravine and broke his back, that bear found him first." The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. Guardian hadn't killed Derek Crawford. He had tried to save him, just as he had tried to save Tommy, just as he had tried to save countless other lost souls over the years. "He stayed with Derek for 3 days, Vincent continued, tears streaming down his face as his carefully constructed narrative crumbled. "Brought him water, kept him warm, fought off scavengers. Derek was still alive when the rescue teams found them, still conscious enough to tell them about the angel bear who had protected him." Guardian's true nature was being revealed in Vincent's breakdown, but Sarah realized with growing horror that this revelation wasn't going to save either of them. If anything, it seemed to be pushing Vincent further over the edge. "Derek died in the hospital," Vincent finished, his voice now barely above a whisper. "Internal injuries, hypothermia, infection. But he lived long enough to make me promise to find that bear and thank him. Instead, I blamed him. I turned my son's guardian angel into the monster responsible for his death because I couldn't face the truth about my own guilt." The admission hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon, and Sarah realized she was looking at a man who had been systematically destroying the very thing his dying son had asked him to protect. The psychological torment Vincent had inflicted on himself had metastasized into a campaign of vengeance against an innocent creature whose only crime was being unable to save a young man from his father's fatal hubris. It was in that moment of revelation and vulnerability that Guardian made his choice. With a sound like distant thunder, he emerged from the cave, his massive frame backlit by the spreading fire, and stepped between Sarah and the armed men who threatened her. His message was clear and unmistakable. If they wanted to hurt her, they would have to go through him first. The sight of Guardian emerging from the smoke-filled cave like some primordial force of nature should have sent Sarah's heart racing with terror, but instead she felt only a profound sense of rightness. This magnificent creature, scarred by years of human cruelty, yet still willing to risk everything to protect her, represented everything noble that the world seemed to have forgotten. As he positioned himself between her and Vincent's hunting party, Sarah understood that she was witnessing something sacred, a moment when love transcended species and fear. Vincent's reaction was immediate and devastating. The careful control he'd maintained throughout his confession shattered completely, replaced by a rage so pure and consuming that it transformed his face into something inhuman. "There he is!" he screamed, raising his rifle with shaking hands. "The monster that destroyed my family. The beast that turned my son against me." But Guardian didn't charge or roar or display any of the aggressive behaviors that might have justified Vincent's hatred. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his massive frame radiating a calm dignity that made Vincent's fury appear even more deranged by contrast. His amber eyes fixed on Vincent with what could only be described as pity, the look of a being who understood suffering and recognized it in another. "Shoot him!" Vincent commanded his men, but something in Guardian's demeanor had shaken them. These were professional killers, men accustomed to violence, yet none of them seemed eager to pull the trigger on a creature that showed no aggression despite being cornered and threatened. Sarah stepped forward, placing herself directly beside Guardian, despite the protests of every survival instinct she possessed. "You want to know what your son really thought about this bear?" she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades dealing with life-and-death situations. Derek didn't just tell the rescue teams to thank him. He made them promise to protect him. The effect of her words on Vincent was like watching a man struck by lightning. He stumbled backward, his rifle dropping to point at the ground as the last pillars of his carefully constructed delusion crumbled around him. Derek spent his final conscious hours in that hospital bed, making the rescue coordinator swear on a Bible that no harm would come to the bear who had saved his life. Sarah continued, drawing on information Martha Henderson had provided during their late-night phone conversation. "He made them write it down, Vincent. Your son's last official statement was a plea for this bear's protection." Vincent's face contorted with anguish as the full weight of his betrayal crashed over him. He hadn't just dishonored his son's memory. He had spent 2 years systematically torturing and killing the very creatures Derek had died trying to protect. The hunting operation, the illegal traps, the campaign of vengeance against innocent wildlife, all of it had been a desecration of everything his son had stood for. "No," Vincent whispered. But even as he spoke the denial, Sarah could see the truth taking root in his eyes. Derek was delirious. The hypothermia, the trauma. He didn't know what he was saying. "He knew exactly what he was saying," Sarah replied firmly. "Because this bear didn't just keep your son company during those 3 days. He saved Derek's life in ways you'll never understand." As if summoned by her words, Guardian began to move with deliberate purpose toward Vincent, each step slow and measured to avoid triggering a defensive response from the armed men. Vincent's hunting party raised their weapons, but their leader made no move to order them to fire. Something in Guardian's approach, the lack of aggression, the almost human quality of his gaze, had rendered Vincent incapable of action. When Guardian was close enough to touch, he did something that defied every assumption about wild animal behavior. He gently placed his massive paw on the ground directly in front of Vincent's boots, then lowered his great head in what could only be interpreted as a gesture of submission and forgiveness. The sound that emerged from Vincent's throat was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard, part sob, part scream, part prayer for forgiveness that would never come. He fell to his knees in front of Guardian, his rifle forgotten in the dirt, his hands reaching out to touch the scars on the bear's paw with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry," Vincent whispered, his voice breaking. "Derek, I'm so sorry. I destroyed everything you tried to save. I became the monster, not him." It was in that moment of profound human vulnerability that tragedy struck, with the cruel randomness that had defined both their lives. Jake Morrison, one of Vincent's hired guns, apparently decided that his employer's breakdown represented a threat to their mission. Without warning or hesitation, he raised his rifle and fired directly at Guardian's chest. The shot rang out across the canyon like thunder, and Guardian's massive frame jerked with the impact. But instead of falling, he did something that spoke to the very core of his nature. He spun his body to shield both Vincent and Sarah from any follow-up shots, absorbing what should have been a fatal wound without thought for his own survival. Sarah's scream of anguish echoed off the canyon walls as Guardian staggered, dark blood spreading across his thick fur. Vincent's response was even more dramatic. He lunged for the rifle Jake had dropped in surprise at Guardian's protective response, his face twisted with a fury that made his earlier rage seem mild by comparison. "You son of a bitch!" Vincent roared, turning the weapon on the man who had just destroyed the last living connection to his son's final act of compassion. "He was protecting us! He was protecting me!" The standoff that followed was a tableau of moral complexity that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. Vincent, the man who had spent 2 years hunting Guardian, now stood over the wounded bear with a rifle trained on his own employee. Jake and the other hunters, confused by their employer's sudden reversal, weren't sure whether to treat Vincent as an ally or a threat. And Guardian, despite his potentially fatal wound, continued to position himself protectively over both Sarah and the man who had been his tormentor. "Put the gun down, Vincent," Jake called out, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "You're not thinking clearly. That thing is a wild animal. It would kill you without hesitation if it thought you were a threat." Vincent's response was to fire a warning shot that sent dirt spraying across Jake's boots. "This thing just took a bullet meant for me. This animal has more honor than any of us." But Guardian was fading fast. The bullet had struck him in the chest, and while it had missed his heart, the blood loss was severe. Sarah pressed her hands against the wound, drawing on her nursing training to apply pressure and slow the bleeding, but they were miles from any medical facility, and Guardian's massive size made field treatment nearly impossible. "We have to get him help," Sarah pleaded, looking up at Vincent with desperate hope. "You have vehicles, radio equipment?" "We can call for a veterinary helicopter. Get him to the wildlife hospital in Missoula." Vincent's face was a mask of anguish as he looked down at the creature he had hunted for so long, now dying because of the violence he had unleashed. "Jake won't let us," he said quietly. "None of them will. They came here to kill this bear, and they'll finish the job regardless of what I want now." As if to confirm his words, Jake and the other hunters began moving into better tactical positions, their weapons trained on the small group huddled around Guardian's massive form. The love and forgiveness that had briefly transformed this place into something sacred was about to be destroyed by men who understood only violence and profit. Guardian's breathing was becoming labored, his great chest rising and falling in increasingly shallow gasps. His eyes, those impossibly expressive amber orbs that had first captured Sarah's heart, began to lose their focus. She held his massive head in her lap, stroking his fur and whispering the same gentle words she had once used to comfort dying soldiers in field hospitals half a world away. "It's okay, big guy," she murmured, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You did good. You saved so many people, protected so many lives. Derek knows. Wherever he is, your boy Derek knows what you did for him." Vincent knelt beside them, his own tears falling onto Guardian's fur as he finally understood the magnitude of what he had destroyed. This wasn't just the death of an animal. It was the end of something pure and irreplaceable in a world that desperately needed more Guardians, not fewer. The sound of approaching helicopters cut through the mountain air like salvation itself, their rhythmic beating growing louder with each passing second. Sarah looked up from Guardian's still form, hardly daring to hope, while Vincent frantically waved his arms at the sky, his earlier composure completely abandoned in his desperation to save the creature he had spent so long trying to destroy. "Here! We're here!" Vincent shouted, his voice hoarse from crying over Guardian's motionless body. "We need medical evacuation now!" But Jake Morrison and his remaining men weren't about to let their payday slip away, regardless of their employer's sudden change of heart. "Stand down!" Jake barked, raising his rifle toward the approaching aircraft. "This is still our operation." What happened next would later be described by wildlife officials as the most remarkable display of interspecies loyalty they had ever witnessed. As Jake prepared to fire on the rescue helicopters, Guardian, who everyone had assumed was dead or dying, suddenly lifted his massive head and released a roar so powerful it seemed to shake the very mountains around them. The sound wasn't one of pain or aggression, but something far more primal, a call that echoed across the wilderness with the authority of the true king of these mountains. And incredibly, impossibly, it was answered. From the tree line came a response that made Sarah's heart leap with understanding. Guardian hadn't been alone in these mountains. The roar that answered his call belonged to a female grizzly, and behind her emerged two cubs, their small forms moving with the same purposeful intelligence their protector had always displayed. Jake's attention snapped toward this new threat, but before he could adjust his aim, the rescue helicopters had landed. The first aircraft disgorged a team of wildlife veterinarians led by Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, whose reputation for saving critically injured animals was legendary throughout the region. The second helicopter brought something even more important. FBI agents who had been tracking Vincent's illegal hunting operation for months. "Federal agents," Special Agent Carol Martinez announced as she stepped from the aircraft, her weapon drawn and her badge clearly visible. "Vincent Crawford, you're under arrest for violations of the Endangered Species Act, illegal wildlife trafficking, and conspiracy to commit environmental terrorism." The revelation that Vincent's hunting operation had been under federal investigation for years sent shockwaves through his remaining men. Jake Morrison, faced with the choice between a firefight with federal agents or surrender, chose the path of self-preservation and dropped his weapon. But the most stunning revelation was yet to come. As Doc Hartwell and her team worked frantically to stabilize Guardian, Agent Martinez approached Sarah with a folder that contained photographs and documents that would change everything she thought she knew about the past 2 years. "Mrs. Mitchell," Agent Martinez said gently, "there's something you need to see. We've been investigating not just Vincent Crawford's hunting operation, but also the circumstances surrounding your grandson's death." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the folder, but what she found inside wasn't the tragic accident report she expected. Instead, she found photographs of Tommy, alive, conscious, and clearly being cared for in what appeared to be a medical facility. "Tommy survived his fall into Swift Creek," Agent Martinez explained, her voice soft with understanding. "He was rescued by this bear and kept alive for 3 days until search teams found them. But he suffered severe hypothermia and brain trauma that left him with significant memory loss." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Sarah processed this information. "He's alive? My Tommy is alive?" "He's been in a specialized care facility in Seattle," Agent Martinez continued. "The decision to tell your family he had died was made by Vincent Crawford's company, which was responsible for the negligent guide service that led to the accident. They thought it would be easier to process insurance claims and avoid lawsuits if there was no survivor to testify about their negligence." The cruelty of it took Sarah's breath away. For 2 years, she had mourned a grandson who was very much alive, while Tommy had been living in a care facility with no memory of his family, no understanding of why no one ever came to visit him. Vincent Crawford hadn't just tried to kill Guardian, he had stolen 2 years of precious time between a grandmother and her beloved grandchild. "There's more," Agent Martinez said, her expression growing even more serious. "Tommy's memories have been slowly returning, and he's been asking about his bear friend and his grandma Cookie." The doctors think seeing you and Guardian together might help restore more of what he's lost." As if summoned by their conversation about him, Guardian began to stir. Dr. Hartwell looked up from her patient with amazement written across her face. "This is impossible," she murmured. "The bullet missed his heart by millimeters, but the angle should have caused massive internal bleeding. It's like something guided the trajectory to avoid the most vital organs." Vincent, who had been standing nearby in handcuffs, spoke up quietly. "Derek always said Guardian was protected by something bigger than himself. Maybe he was right." The revelation about Tommy's survival had transformed Vincent's guilt into something even more complex. Not only had his hunting campaign been targeting the creature that saved his own son's life, but his company's cover-up had robbed Sarah of 2 years with her grandson. The weight of these accumulated sins seemed to age him decades in the span of minutes. "I'll testify," Vincent said suddenly, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised everyone present. "I'll tell them everything about the illegal hunts, the cover-up, the systematic torture of wildlife in these mountains. I'll make sure Guardian and every other animal in this region is protected." Dr. Hartwell's team had successfully stabilized Guardian, and the great bear was showing signs of consciousness. As his amber eyes fluttered open, the first thing he saw was Sarah's face, and the soft chuffing sound he made in response brought tears to the eyes of everyone present, even the hardened federal agents. "He's going to make it," Dr. Hartwell announced with professional satisfaction, tinged by personal amazement. "This bear has the strongest will to live I've ever encountered. It's like he knows he has unfinished business." The female grizzly and her cubs had remained at the edge of the clearing throughout the drama, watching the humans with Guardian's same remarkable intelligence. As the veterinary team prepared to transport Guardian to their facility, the female approached slowly, her massive frame moving with surprising grace. What happened next would be captured on video by news crews who had arrived with the second wave of helicopters, and the footage would eventually be viewed by millions of people around the world. The female grizzly gently nuzzled Guardian's face, then looked directly at Sarah with an expression of what could only be described as gratitude and trust. "She's thanking you," Joseph Crowfeather said softly. The elderly Blackfeet elder had arrived with the rescue teams, having been contacted by Martha Henderson about the federal investigation. "In our tradition, when a protector is wounded in service to others, the clan acknowledges the debt. She's telling you that Guardian's family will remember what you did for him." The emotional weight of the moment was almost too much for Sarah to bear. In the span of a few hours, she had gone from mourning what she thought was the death of her last connection to Tommy, to learning that her grandson was alive and that Guardian would survive to continue his remarkable mission of protecting the lost and vulnerable. As Guardian was carefully loaded onto the medical helicopter, his eyes never left Sarah's face. Dr. Hartwell had to smile at the obvious bond between the elderly woman and the massive predator who clearly trusted her completely. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Hartwell said as they prepared for takeoff, "I know this might sound unusual, but I think Guardian's recovery would be significantly improved if you were involved in his care. Would you consider staying at our facility while he heals?" Sarah's answer was immediate and certain. "Wild horses couldn't drag me away from him now." Agent Martinez had one final surprise. "Mrs. Mitchell, we've arranged for Tommy to be transferred to a facility closer to where Guardian is being treated. The doctors think that reuniting them might help both of them heal, physically and emotionally." As the helicopter lifted off, carrying Guardian toward medical care and Sarah toward a reunion she had never dared to hope for, Vincent Crawford stood in handcuffs watching the aircraft disappear into the distance. For the first time in 2 years, his face showed something other than rage or despair. It showed peace. "Derek would be proud," he whispered to Agent Martinez as she led him toward the law enforcement helicopter. His bear friend is going to be okay, and his protector is getting the recognition she deserves. The mountains of Montana had witnessed many things over the millennia, but perhaps never anything quite as remarkable as this. A story of redemption that proved love could indeed transcend species. Forgiveness could heal even the deepest wounds, and sometimes the most broken souls could find their way back to grace. 3 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood on the porch of what had once been her lonely cabin, watching the most beautiful sight she had ever witnessed. Guardian, his wounds fully healed and his spirit stronger than ever, was gently playing with 10-year-old Tommy Patterson in the specially designed sanctuary that now surrounded her property. The boy's laughter echoed across the Montana mountains, a sound that had been missing from Sarah's world for far too long. Tommy's memories had returned gradually, piece by precious piece, as he spent time with both Sarah and Guardian. The reunion had been everything the doctors had hoped for and more. The moment Tommy saw Guardian, his face had lit up with recognition and joy, and he had run to the great bear without a trace of fear, throwing his small arms around Guardian's massive neck as if greeting an old friend. "Grandma Cookie, watch this!" Tommy called out, demonstrating how Guardian could count by tapping his paw on the ground. "He remembers everything I taught him before the accident." The accident was how they all referred to those dark days by Swift Creek, though everyone understood it had been something far more meaningful, a test of love and loyalty that had bound their unlikely family together forever. Tommy's brain injury had left him with some challenges, but his spirit remained as bright and adventurous as ever, and Guardian's protective presence gave him the confidence to explore and learn without fear. The Montana Wildlife Sanctuary that now occupied the former Crawford hunting grounds was thriving beyond anyone's expectations. Vincent's confession and cooperation with federal authorities had led to the largest wildlife protection grant in Montana's history, creating a safe haven for injured and orphaned animals across the region. Guardian served as the sanctuary's unofficial ambassador, his gentle nature and remarkable intelligence helping to educate visitors about the complex emotional lives of wildlife. Sarah had found her calling as the sanctuary's director, her nursing background proving invaluable in caring for wounded animals, while her experience with Guardian had given her insights into animal behavior that amazed professional zoologists. Every morning she would make coffee for two again, but now the second cup was for Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, who had moved to Montana permanently to oversee the sanctuary's medical programs. "You know what I love most about this place?" Tommy asked one evening as they sat on the porch, Guardian resting peacefully beside them. "It's that everybody here gets a second chance, just like me and Guardian got a second chance to be together." The wisdom in those words, spoken by a child who had faced more trauma than most adults, never failed to move Sarah. Tommy was right. This sanctuary had become a place of second chances, where broken spirits found healing and lost souls discovered they were not alone. Vincent Crawford, serving his sentence at a minimum security federal facility, had become an unexpected advocate for wildlife protection, writing articles and giving interviews about the psychological toll of environmental destruction. His letters to Sarah, filled with gratitude and continued apologies, spoke of a man finding redemption through service to the creatures he had once persecuted. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Sometimes, the greatest love stories aren't between people at all, but between souls who recognize something sacred in each other, regardless of species or circumstance. Guardian's gentle rumble of contentment, Tommy's sleepy murmur of "I love you, Grandma Cookie," and the peaceful silence of the sanctuary at twilight told Sarah everything she needed to know about the meaning of family. Love, she had learned, truly did find a way. Always. Dear friends, Sarah Mitchell's incredible journey reminds us that it's never too late to discover our true purpose. At 67, when most people told her she was just a crazy old woman, Sarah found the courage to protect an innocent soul who needed her. Her story proves that our golden years aren't about winding down. They're about stepping up when it matters most. Like Sarah, many of us have experienced profound loss, felt forgotten by family, or struggled with fixed incomes that barely cover our needs. But within each of us lies the same strength that transformed a lonely widow into a wildlife sanctuary director, a grieving grandmother into a protector of the innocent. Sarah's bond with Guardian shows us that love doesn't diminish with age, it deepens, becoming more precious because we understand how fragile and fleeting it can be. Her willingness to risk everything for a creature who couldn't speak her language reminds us that true communication happens heart to heart, soul to soul. Sometimes our most meaningful relationships come when we least expect them, with those who need us most. Your wisdom, your experience, your compassion, these aren't relics of your past. They're gifts the world desperately needs right now. Share with us what unexpected friendship or purpose has brought new meaning to your life after 50. Have you ever felt called to protect someone or something that others might not understand? Please leave a comment below. Your story could inspire someone who needs to hear it today.